It makes me comfortable to know that I'm accurate. So I agree that that some of the things that were truly relevant in 1787 are not relevant today in terms of slavery, in terms of fear of having a king, although I do agree that the presidency has evolved over the last 235 years and changed, and it's much different than it was back then. A couple of things, and I think this is, for me, I just to put it out on the table right here now, I think the sticking point for me on this issue is that the concerns about larger states having more influence over than smaller states, I think that's still a relevant issue today. And I do think that the Electoral College is an equalizer in that sense. There is no scenario in a national popular vote that I can think of in which New Mexico would continue to be relevant in a presidential election. And it is today, because in most elections, New Mexico being a swing state, we see multiple scenarios in which the 5 electoral votes of New Mexico could eventually affect the outcome of a presidential election. And so while I agree that, certainly continuing an institution that, was at least in part based on protecting slave states is pretty atrocious and pretty hard to defend, there are still some other concerns back then that do exist today, and that's for me going to be the part that I think I'm going to need to work with the most. So.
And that's good. And a lot of that we're going to talk about in section 2, in session 2, where we really get into what is the impact of the current system and how would it change with the national popular vote. Steve?
I have a kind of a pulser question, because I've seen polling that suggests that there's massive public support across partisan lines, across geographic lines, et cetera, for moving to a direct election of the president. What I'm curious about is if there's any polling out there that indicates that people think that we already direct the president directly.
What's the error? I don't know.
Just guessing, I would think that there's a very large percentage that already thinks that we directly the president.
I agree with that, and I don't know, but I will try to find that out. Does anyone else have any information on that? But I will try to look at that. I think I saw a paper on that, so I'll look at that. Paul, yeah.
To the point of the Electoral College system giving more representation to the smaller states, as Maggie addressed. That's true, of course. But it seems to me a good part of that is true because of the winner-take-all aspects of the Electoral College. Not so much you could, in fact, I think it was originally considered, you could try to make that proportionate some way. And in fact, 2 states do, in one sense, because they allocate their electoral votes to the congressional district. So I just wanted to make that point. It's the winner-take-all aspect of the Electoral College that really is a significant factor in this bias, whether you like it or not.
The point about protecting slavery is inflammatory and sort of makes us recoil, right? But I think we need to remind ourselves that was a different time in the sense that what had happened prior to independence was that England had outlawed slavery. So in part, some of the southern states' motivations for getting involved in the independence was about protecting slavery. And we don't recoil from independence. That was an extremely positive thing. And so I just think that that's a little bit inflammatory to say, oh, this was about protecting slavery. A lot of things back then were about protecting slavery that have evolved as institutions and have changed us. And while we, of course, would never be interested in supporting an institution that protects slavery, there are other things going on. And I just sort of want to raise that. Because it does. It feels inflammatory. Ooh, they're protecting slavery. We don't like it. And there's a lot of stuff in our history that we would recoil from, but we've evolved. And that's
good. Yeah. That's cool. I think that's a good point. Okay. Gloria?
I think that slavery was a bedrock issue in the determination of how voting was to be determined. I mean, there were some slave owners whose vote, if they owned a lot of slaves, was immensely increased. And I think today, in many ways, we can substitute minorities for the word slavery when we are talking about how we're going to look at how this system is set up. There are so many issues, even in our last election, that came to the surface in minority communities that were just as important and made just as much difference as that 3/5 of a person made when this whole system was being set up. And so I think we may recoil from slavery, but slavery was the underpinning of almost everything that happened. And that's just how it was.
Sorry, I wanted to address the small state issue. First by saying that Congress does address this problem. So I think it's relevant, but we do have an institution that does already balance the rights of large and small states.
The Senate does.
Yeah, so, yeah. And also in terms of, I know we get into this in the presentation, but in terms of it having an equalizing effect, it actually very much distorts the weight of votes. So votes in Wyoming are worth like 4 times the weight of votes in California. So we might think about it as equalizing across states, but it certainly doesn't equalize across voter populations.
But that was by design, was it not?
What do you mean?
I mean, it was designed to do that,
Yes.
to give the small states a big voice. And I think to your point, I mean, you can look at the South as the small states at the time who wanted more power. And so-
Small in terms of the number of people who could actually vote.
Yes.
They had representation, so each plantation owner had the power of 3/5 of all of his holdings in terms of the vote. That's basically how it translated.
Right. But the Electoral College did the same thing. It protected those smaller states somewhat from the larger states, which it still does today. If you're going to do proportional electoral, you may as well do popular.